Picture a tank so thinly armored that a standard machine gun, the same gun bolted to a jeep, a half-track, a patrol boat, could punch a clean hole through it at 300 yards. When U.S. Marines captured an intact Type 95 Hago on Kiska Island in August 1943 and shipped it to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, the Army technicians who ran the tests weren't shocked by the results. They had already seen captured specimens and already had a pretty good idea what a .50 caliber AP round would do to 12 millimeters of face-hardened steel. They ran the tests because they needed numbers on paper, and those numbers became doctrine, the formal basis for how Marines and Army soldiers across the Pacific understood exactly what they were up against when a Hago rolled toward them, and what they had available to stop it. This is the story of how Japan's most produced tank of the war became, in the words of one captured Japanese diary from Saipan, a vehicle whose shells bounced off like baseballs from American armor, while American machine gun rounds went straight through Japanese steel. It's a story about industrial mathematics, about a design philosophy forged in 1933 that couldn't survive 1942, and about the men on both sides who paid the price for that gap. Major Tomio Hara was 38 years old when the Imperial Japanese Army Technical Bureau assigned him the light tank project in July 1933. Hara was, by any measure, the most accomplished armor engineer Japan had. He understood steel, he understood mobility, and he understood what the Army's cavalry branch wanted above all else: speed over protection. The problem that sparked the whole program was straightforward. During joint exercises in Manchuria in 1932 and 1933, the existing Type 89 medium tank couldn't keep pace with motorized infantry moving at 40 kilometers per hour. The cavalry wanted something that could, and whatever it weighed or however thin its armor ran, it had to hit 40 kilometers per hour on a road and hold together in the field. The infantry branch, watching these same exercises, had a different concern. At the 1935 Army Technical Bureau meeting, where the final specifications got locked, infantry officers argued that the armor was already too thin, and said plainly that this machine would get men killed. The cavalry overruled them. The Type 95 Hago entered Japanese Army service in 1935, weighing 7.5 metric tons, with a maximum armor thickness of 12 millimeters, just under half an inch, designed to do one specific thing: stop rifle caliber rounds. A standard 7.7 millimeters bullet fired from standard infantry range. Nothing else was part of the calculation. Hara's design wasn't sloppy. The tank ran reliably, started in cold weather when German armor sometimes wouldn't, and crossed streams and rice paddies that bogged down heavier machines. The Mitsubishi air-cooled diesel engine produced 120 horsepower. Top road speed reached 45 kilometers per hour, and for infantry support in Manchuria against lightly armed Chinese forces in the mid-1930s, the Hago was exactly what the cavalry had asked for. The problem was that Japan went on fighting a different war than the one Hara designed for. Mitsubishi built the first production Hago in 1936. The construction method was riveted and welded rolled steel plates fastened to an internal angle iron frame, the same basic approach as European tanks of the early 1930s. The plates were face-hardened, meaning the outer surface was treated with carbon to create an extremely hard shell over a softer, more flexible backing. In theory, this helped shatter incoming projectiles rather than letting them cut cleanly through. In practice, it created a secondary problem that Japanese tankers rarely survived long enough to report. When a non-penetrating hit sheared interior rivets. Those rivets became projectiles inside the fighting compartment. The crew of 3 driver forward right, hull machine gunner forward left, and the tank commander who functioned simultaneously as gunner, loader, and the man trying to observe anything through a vision port while the vehicle was moving sat inside a steel box where even a miss could be lethal. Communication between the commander and driver ran through a speaking tube, and most Ha-Go light tanks had no radio at all. When 2 tanks needed to coordinate, they used hand signals or stopped. The armament was a Type 94 37mm gun in a one-man turret with 2 7.7mm machine guns, one in the hull and one mounted rearward in the turret. The 37mm was adequate against the unarmored vehicles and field fortifications it was built to fight. Against American armor of any kind, it was, as one post-war assessment put it, completely useless. By the end of the war, Mitsubishi and 6 other manufacturers, Niigata Iron Works, Sagami Arsenal, Kokura Arsenal, Hitachi, Kobe Seikosho, and Hino Motor had collectively built roughly 2,300 Ha-Go tanks. Some estimates go as high as 2,378, the number varying because many Japanese production records were burned before American forces could secure them. What's not in dispute is that the Ha-Go was Japan's most numerous tank of the entire war by a wide margin, and that almost every single one of them went into combat already obsolete. The first serious warning came not in the Pacific, but on the Mongolian steppe 3 years before Pearl Harbor. In the summer of 1939, a border dispute between Japanese-occupied Manchuria and Soviet-controlled Mongolia escalated into a full mechanized battle near the Khalkhin Gol River. The Japanese called it Nomonhan, and history remembers it as the fight that demonstrated conclusively that Japanese armor was not ready for peer combat. The 4th Tank Regiment, commanded by Colonel Tamada Yoshio, committed Ha-Go and Type 89 medium tanks against Soviet BT-5 and BT-7 fast tanks. Japanese infantry officers watching the engagement described their own tank force as useless and said the machines were all destroyed from simple piano wire, an exaggerated but indicative summary of how thoroughly the Japanese armor was outclassed. The BT tank's 45mm gun outranged the Ha-Go's 37mm by over 300 meters, and Soviet anti-tank fire destroyed 42 of 73 Japanese tanks in the 4th Regiment alone. The battle shocked certain sections of the Japanese army. General Tomoyuki Yamashita was dispatched to Germany specifically to study Wehrmacht armored doctrine, an implicit admission that Japan was 2 generations behind, and proposals circulated for heavier, better protected vehicles. Then the Navy got the steel. Japan's inter-service rivalry between the Army and Navy was, throughout the war, one of the most consequential and least discussed factors in Japanese strategic failures. The Imperial Japanese Navy consumed steel, industrial capacity, and engineering talent at a rate the Army's tank program simply could not compete with. By 1941, tank production had been assigned Priority A status. By late 1943, it had fallen to Priority D, as aircraft and naval construction crowded out armor manufacturing. Japan's 4 remaining tank-making facilities couldn't be expanded, and the narrow-gauge railways that served them imposed a width limit of roughly 8 feet on any vehicle they needed to transport. The Ha-Go, already outdated by the standards of 1,939, went to war in 1941 as the most numerous tank Japan could field because nothing better existed in sufficient numbers. The successor designs, the Type 98 Kini and the Type 2 Ki-2, reached approximately 38 and 34 units, respectively, in total production for the entire war, and never mattered in any engagement. By the time Marines landed on Guadalcanal in August 1942, the Ha-Go's vulnerability was suspected but not yet formally quantified in American field manuals. On the night of the 23rd of October, 1942, Japanese forces committed 9 tanks, a mix of Type 97 Chi-Ha medium tanks and Type 95 Ha-Go light tanks from the 1st Independent Tank Company under Captain Maeda, to a crossing attempt at the Matanikau River's sandbar. General Haruyoshi Hyakutake had ordered a coordinated assault to retake Henderson Field, with the tanks crossing first to break the Marine line. The 3rd Battalion, 1st Marines and 3rd Battalion, 7th Marines, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel William J. McKelvey, were waiting with 2 37mm M3 anti-tank guns, positioned covering the sandbar, and 3 75mm M3 gun motor carriages, half-tracks, with a howitzer mounted on the back, covering the flanks. The 37mm M3 anti-tank gun could penetrate 48mm of steel at 500 yards against the Ha-Go's 12mm, and not a single Japanese tank crossed the Matanikau. Captain Maeda's company was destroyed in detail. The Marine tank companies held in reserve were never committed because there was nothing left to commit them against, and the first significant Japanese tank attack of the Pacific Campaign ended in under an hour. The Marines hadn't yet had the chance to sit down with a captured machine and measure it. That came later. In June 1942, Japanese forces had invaded the western Aleutian Islands of Attu and Kiska, the only American territory in the Pacific to fall under Japanese occupation, and the 11th Tank Regiment brought Type 95 Ha-Go tanks to Kiska to defend against the expected American counterattack. They waited 14 months. When Allied forces finally landed on Kiska on the 15th of August, 1943, the Japanese had already evacuated under fog cover 3 weeks earlier, leaving behind equipment, food, even living dogs, and among the abandoned material were 2 intact Ha-Go tanks. Both were shipped to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, America's central facility for testing captured enemy equipment, the same place they had taken German armor from North Africa, the same place they would eventually run every major weapon system they could capture or acquire. The Ha-Go tests confirmed what the penetration tables already predicted, and the formal specifications went into TME 30-480, the War Department's Handbook on Japanese Military Forces, published the 1st of October 1944. The handbook listed the armor as 6 to 12 millimeters, 0.2, 4 to 0.4, 7 inches, and confirmed the plates were of good quality, which made the thinness more damning, not less. Good steel, not enough of it. The second Aberdeen specimen, the one that survived testing intact, was eventually displayed at the U.S. Army Ordnance Museum at Aberdeen, and when the museum closed in 2010, the collection transferred to Fort Lee, Virginia, where it remains. The M2 Browning machine gun fired the M2 AP cartridge, a 706, 7-grain black-tipped armor-piercing projectile at 2,810 feet per second. The standard acceptance test required complete perforation of 0.875 inches of hardened steel at 100 yards. At 300 yards, interpolating from the Marine Corps' own MCWP 3 to 15.1 penetration tables, the M2 AP round defeated approximately 20 to 22 millimeters of face-hardened armor against the Ha-Go's maximum plate thickness of 12 millimeters. That gap, 8 to 10 millimeters of excess penetration at 300 yards, meant the round didn't just hole the tank, it went through and kept moving. At 600 meters, roughly 656 yards, the M2AP still defeated 12.7 millimeters of face-hardened steel, and the thinnest surfaces of the Hago, the 6 millimeter rear deck and roof, were vulnerable beyond 1,000 meters. Standard M33 ball ammunition, the non-armor-piercing version, could punch through 8 millimeters at 500 meters, sufficient to defeat the Hago's thinnest surfaces without specialty rounds. Soviet engineers who captured and tested a Ha-Go in Manchuria in August 1945 wrote in their evaluation report that a high-caliber machine gun would be a deadly opponent for the tank, and noted the vehicle could even be penetrated by a rifle bullet from close range. A post-war U.S. military advisory explicitly stated that the 50 BMG had penetrated Ha-Go tanks at close ranges during the Pacific Campaign. For comparison, a standard M337 mm anti-tank gun, the lightest dedicated anti-tank weapon the Marines carried, penetrated 48 millimeters at 500 yards, while the Japanese 37 mm gun on the Ha-Go penetrated 25 to 36 millimeters in the same range band, not enough to defeat American armor and not even enough to defeat the Stuart light tank, which had 44.5 millimeters on its thickest surfaces. Japanese tankers in Burma captured an M3 Stuart Hulk and tested their 37 millimeters against it from every angle at every range. The shells bounced. Tarawa showed what happened when Marine Shermans met Ha-Go tanks directly. The 20th of November 1943, the 2nd Marine Division landed on Betio Island in the Tarawa Atoll, where roughly 4,700 Japanese troops under Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki were defending, including 7 Type 95 Ha-Go tanks belonging to the 7th Sasebo Special Naval Landing Force, commanded at the tank level by Ensign Otani. The Japanese had dug the tanks into the coral as fixed gun positions, a decision that reflected both tactical conservatism and an accurate assessment that mobile Ha-Go tanks against American weapons would be destroyed the moment they moved. Company C, 1st Corps Medium Tank Battalion, commanded by First Lieutenant Edward L. Bale, Jr., brought 14 M4A2 Shermans ashore, 33 tons each, front armor 51 to 76 millimeters, 75 millimeters M3 gun, penetrating 88 millimeters of steel at 100 meters. A Sherman called China Gal engaged one of the dug-in Ha-Go positions. A Japanese 37 millimeters round hit China Gal's turret ring and jammed it, so the crew drove the Sherman into the Ha-Go and crushed it, 33 tons against 7.5 tons. All 7 Ha-Go tanks on Betio were destroyed, along with 2 additional tanks on nearby Macon Island. 8 months later, Saipan produced the largest Japanese tank attack of the entire Pacific War. General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding Japanese forces on Saipan, decided on the 16th of June, 1944, 2 days after American landings, to commit everything he had. The 9th Tank Regiment under Colonel Hideki Goto, reinforced by 9 Ha-Go tanks from the Yokosuka 1st Special Naval Landing Force, 44 tanks total with 500 to 1,000 infantry, attacking American lines near Charan Kanoa airstrip before dawn on June 17. Lieutenant Colonel William K. Jones commanded the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines, in the path of the attack. His executive officer, Major James A. Donovan, Jr., would later describe what happened as a madhouse of noise, tracers, and flashing lights. Navy destroyers offshore fired star shells on request, turning darkness into a strobing artificial daylight, while Marine artillery zeroed in, and the 37mm and 75mm anti-tank guns were already positioned. Private First Class Charles D. Merritt and Private First Class Herbert J. Hodges, moving in the open under fire with M1A1 bazookas, knocked out 7 Japanese tanks with 7 rockets, and both received Navy crosses. Corporal Donald Watson threw phosphorus grenades onto a passing Ha-Go, shot the crew as they climbed out, then pulled a wounded Marine to safety, another Navy cross. Captain Norman K. Thomas, who had already earned a Silver Star at Tarawa, was killed by Japanese tank fire while advancing. When dawn came, the ground in front of the 1st Battalion, 6th Marines was covered in wrecked and burning Japanese armor. Of the 44 tanks that attacked, 32 were destroyed in the night engagement, and the remaining 12, 6 Ha-Go, 6 Chi-Ha retreated, only to be found and destroyed on June 24 by Company C of the 2nd Marine Tank Battalion near Garapan. A diary recovered from a soldier of the 9th Tank Regiment after the battle described the encounter with American Shermans. "We opened fire on them, but our shells bounced off them like baseballs owing to their thick armor. Tanks of the 9th Tank Regiment were destroyed one after another, bursting into flames." Baron Takeichi Nishi was 43 years old when he landed on Iwo Jima in late 1944, commanding the 26th Tank Regiment. 12 years earlier, he had been a global celebrity at the 1932 Los Angeles Olympics. Nishi won the gold medal in equestrian show jumping aboard his horse Uranus, a genuinely remarkable feat for a Japanese cavalry officer clearing courses designed by and for European aristocracy. He stayed in Hollywood afterward, knew Mary Pickford, drank with Douglas Fairbanks, and his photograph appeared in newspapers across the United States. Americans who had cheered for him at the Coliseum now fought against him on a volcanic island 8 miles long. Nishi, who walked Iwo Jima's ridges in Hermes, riding boots to scout tank positions himself, recognized immediately that his Ha-Go and Chi-Ha tanks were useless against American armor in open ground, and buried them to the turret as fixed pillboxes, concrete reinforced firing positions that negated the Sherman's weight and mobility advantage while using the tank gun as a fixed emplacement. It extended the fight but did not change the outcome. Of the 26th Tank Regiment's tanks, only 2 survived the battle. Americans broadcast surrender appeals by loudspeaker. "Baron Nishi, the world would regret losing you. Your friends in America are listening." He never answered and died on or around the 22nd of March, 1945. The circumstances never fully established. On Peleliu, the 15th of September, 1944, Marine tankers in M4, A-2 Shermans discovered that the 75mm AP round overpenetrated the Ha-Go. It punched through one wall and out the other without detonating, leaving a hole at entry and a hole at exit, but not necessarily killing the crew or igniting the tank. One Sherman gunner, watching his tracer rounds ricochet straight upward off a Japanese tank hull, recognized he was hitting at a bad angle, switched aim, and fired one 75mm HE round. The Ha-Go exploded 20 yards away. The solution adopted by Marine tankers was to use high explosive against the Ha-Go rather than armor-piercing, since the blast and fragmentation of a 75mm HE round against 1-2 mm plate was devastating, where the AP round was wasted on a target too thin to trigger its fusing properly. Lieutenant Colonel Robert W. Boyd, commanding the 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, watched the 14th Infantry Division's Hago Company attack across the Peleliu airfield 15 to 17 tanks with supporting infantry, and described them as running around wildly, apparently without coordination within our lines. Not one survived the crossing. The Philippines in early 1945 was where the largest Japanese armored force ever committed to the Pacific met its end. The 2nd Tank Division, under Lieutenant General Yoshiharu Iwanaka, deployed 220 tanks, including 20 Hago, to defend Luzon against the American landings at Lingayen Gulf in January 1945. Yamashita ordered many of the tanks into static dug-in positions immediately, not because the tactical situation demanded it, but because fuel had become too scarce to sustain mobile operations. The tanks became concrete emplacements, and the 6th Army's internal publication, Tank News, called the fight around San Manuel in late January 1945 the hottest tank-on-tank battle in the Pacific. By the 5th of March 1945, the 2nd Tank Division had lost 203 Chiha and 19 Hago tanks, and the entire armored reserve Japan had husbanded for the defense of the Philippines was gone in 6 weeks. Major Tomio Hara, the man who designed the Hago, who argued for speed over armor at the 1935 Technical Bureau meeting and heard the infantry officers warn him before the cavalry overruled them, survived the war, and lived until 1990. In the 1970s, he published detailed technical histories of Japanese armor through Profile Publications, 2 volumes designated AFV Weapons Profiles 49 and 54 that remain among the primary sources every serious Western scholar of Japanese armor cites. Hara understood by then exactly where the design had failed, and it wasn't in the engineering. The steel was good quality. Aberdeen confirmed that. The engine was reliable. The tracks held up in tropical terrain. The tank did what the cavalry asked it to do in 1935. The failure was strategic. Japan built 2,300 of a vehicle designed for 1,933 Manchuria and sent it into combat against the industrial output of a country that had built 49,234 M4 Shermans by the end of the war. Japan built 6,450 tanks total across all types in 14 years of production, a figure roughly matching American Sherman output in any given 18-month stretch. When Aberdeen's engineers sat down with the Kiska specimen and ran the armor measurements, they confirmed what the infantry officers had told Hara's bureau in 1,935. 12 millimeters was not enough. It had never been enough for the war Japan was about to fight. The .50 caliber test at 300 yards wasn't a revelation. It was a formal acknowledgement of something the men on Guadalcanal and Tarawa and Saipan had already learned the hard way, that Japan had sent its tankers into battle in machines that a machine gunner on a jeep could kill at 3 football fields. The Kiska Hago that passed through Aberdeen ended up on a concrete pedestal at the Army Ordnance Museum, where schoolchildren walked past it and veterans occasionally stopped. The holes, if the gun crews put them where the tables said to aim, would have been in the side armor straight through, front to back at 300 yards, with rounds left in the belt for whatever came next. The cavalry got their speed in 1935. Japan's tankers paid for it from Guadalcanal to Iwo Jima.